Hey guys, and welcome to today's video, and this time we're finally getting some paint down onto the Rubric Marines. So if you haven't caught the video before, go and check out the unboxing and the assembly video that I've done, and we'll move into some painting. So starting with the priming then, so for me I tend not to use a spray can for my prime, I tend to airbrush, so using Vallejo's base coat of black here, and that's put through my Iwata Neo airbrush. It's a fairly cheap airbrush, but it's pretty good standard and it's great for priming models. So what I've done here is I've set up my airbrush booth and I've blue tacked the models down onto some black card. What I've done is actually cut the audio out of this so that you don't hear the compressor going and the airbrush going. Not very exciting, and then you can hear my voice instead, which is far better, I'm sure. So it's a simple case then of just spraying the models black. So the next stage then is to go for some gold. In this case the Thousand Suns are covered in lots of gold and lots of blue, so you have a choice of either going for blue first or gold first. But given the level of trim and the way that I'm going to be painting this with a dry brush, as I find unless you're going for Golden Demon non-metallic metal style, this is a very effective method to paint gold. So I'm going for gold first rather than blue. Just purely based on the technique that I was going to be painting the gold. If I'd gone blue first, I'd be forever touching the blue back up and there'd be specks of metallic paint all over the place. So I'm actually using Games Workshop's new spray can, or fairly new spray can that came out with Age of Sigmar, as it's nice and easy, and putting thick metallic paint through an airbrush can cause it to clog quite quickly. So this was a far better solution, and the gold is really quite nice out of this can. Games Workshop paints have come on leaps and bounds over the years. Had they not had this can, then I would have gone with an airbrush version, but this worked just well. So there we go, that's all the gold applied. Do have to turn the models upside down though, you can't just spray them like this, otherwise you'll end up with black patches underneath. So the next stage then to give the gold some depth is to wash them with Reichland Flesh Shade, which is a Games Workshop colour again. So getting a nice little puddle into my palette there. There's a porcelain palette that I use for this. And all it is a case of making sure you've got a nice amount of colour in the brush. I'm using I think it's a size 2 brush in this case. And really focusing on working the colour into the recesses of the model. So that's all 10 models now done with the Reikland flesh shade and allowed to dry. Very important that you do give it some good time to dry and as it's drying, keep an eye on the paint because washes do tend to pool and puddle a little bit. So you might need to push the paint around a little bit while it dries, making sure that it doesn't sort of settle and clog where you don't want it to. So as you can see, it sort of toned down the gold from being a bit too garish, and now has a little bit of depth to it. The next stage then is to start bringing some highlights to the gold. So here I'm going to be using quite an old dry brush here, not even sure where I acquired this brush from. So I'm using some Vallejo Game Colour here, so this starting with Glorious Gold, which is a fairly near match to Retributor Armour Spray from Games Workshop. So putting a small dollop into the palette there, it's a case of just dry brushing. That's a very common technique. So you just get some paint, work it into the bristles on a piece of tissue until very little paint comes off, and then apply it in the direction towards the sharper edges of the model. So here I've just started with the legs, and just making sure that you're trying to catch the direction of the edges. So up and down in this case, and just working through all the parts. It's a fairly light technique, you don't want to be too heavy-handed with this, as you are just trying to catch those sharper edges with the colour, and just brighten up some of the flatter panels of gold. You don't want to obliterate the flesh wash that you've already put on. So once that's been allowed to dry, the next stage is to go with a slightly brighter gold. So here we're going with polished gold from Vallejo Game Colour. And similar technique as we've just done with the polished gold, only slightly less paint where possible and more focused on the edges and a lighter brushing technique. You're really trying to pick the edges of the trim up this time rather than some of the flatter panels, and ensuring that you push more from the top down so that it really does reflect where the light is coming onto the model. So it's more top down, front on than it is sort of bottom up, because you don't have highlights at the very bottom of the model. So you can see where I'm focusing now. It really is just trying to catch those top glints of the gold part of the armour. I'm not too fussed about the rest of the shoulder pad, as that's all going to be painted blue after this. And you can see why I've gone with gold first rather than blue first, just by the nature of this painting technique. Just catching those edges of the backpack there and the top of the helmet. And then we spin through. The rest of the model is exactly the same as that first one. So the final part of the gold work then is an edging of silver. So I've gone with chainmail silver here. And I'm going dry brush rather than trying to edge paint it. And this time you really are focusing on the really sharp pointy corners of the model. So those very front and back parts of the shoulder pads, the tops of the knees, the tops of the helmet. Really want this to be really light. You don't want it to look silver. You just want it to look like it's catching that top piece of light to make the highlight really pop. So you can see here I'm just focusing on those tiny parts of the model. This process should be fairly quick. It should be a lot quicker than the previous two dry brush techniques, as you are just trying to catch those very edge pieces with the silver. Really light technique. You see I'm only doing sort of a couple of strokes in each area. It's a very subtle part of the process, and that's him done. So you can see how quickly that was compared to some of the other dry brushing, and we can move straight on to the next model very quickly. So the last section on this video then, I don't want to run the video too long, is just to fill in the armour panels in Thousand Suns Blue. So I'm using a fine detail brush here, so it's probably, I think this was a 000 brush. So it's a very fine tip brush because you really have to avoid the gold parts you've now already painted. And the armour edging is very ornate, and there's lots of individual panels. So you have the shoulders, part of the head, the helmet itself, and then all the parts of the leg greaves as well, and the hands. So thinning the paint fairly well here, to be honest, to make sure you've got good control. You don't want it to be running, but you want it to go on smooth. And as you're now covering some gold, you're probably going to do a couple of coats of this paint really, just to make sure that you have no gold shining through. So just making sure I'm happy with the paint thin, just using water here rather than any chemical thinners. You can see I'm just sort of shaping the brush there on the edge of the palette before I commence, just making sure that there's a fine point on the brush. Before anyone comments, yes, I do hold my paintbrushes quite funny, but it does help with the camera viewing as well, rather than having my index finger pointing all over towards the end of the brush. Just being exceptionally careful on the leg here, so you can see I'm just trying to make sure that I don't hit those armour panels. Now if you don't push the blue into the very edges where it does meet the gold, it's not a big problem, because the next stage where we're going to wash the armour down and put some depth into that colour, it will sort of mask that edging. So if you don't go too near the gold, and it's not a big problem. But if you can, you know, then power to you. But don't be too concerned about it. Just make sure you don't get it on the gold is the key. So now all the models have had their blue parts done. It's a case of just darkening down and giving the blue a shade. And I'm using Games Workshop's Null Oil for this. It's a very good wash. Previously I might have gone with an oil wash, which I do on some of my Forgeworld models. But this is nice and simple. It dries a lot quicker than using oil washes. Oil washes can take 24-48 hours before they really go off properly. And then to make them really effective, you also need a gloss varnish as well, and that just takes a lot of time. We're talking bog standard infantry. Okay, they're not overly bog standard, they're very powerful infantry, but they are going to die in droves, and you're not going to have too much time necessarily to spend on them unless you're making it for a big painting entry. But just making sure that I'm pushing the black into the corners where it does meet the gold. And it really helps make the blue pop. And it's just a case of wherever you've painted blue, now you start painting the black and just pushing it into those corners. So there we have it. We have now washed all of the armour parts. And you can see that one in the background standing up on his own is still drying a little bit, I believe. But you can see now that the shoulder pads have got some good definition. The gold is looking good, and they're now beginning to really look like Thousand Sun Marines. Nice blue, nice and gold. So the final part of this video we're going to start bringing the blue back to a bit more of a brilliance and start working on the first part of the highlight. So we're going back to our Thousand Suns blue colour here from Games Workshop. And what we're going to do now is start working the highlights up on the blue parts. So for this, it's almost a glaze, but it's probably a bit thicker than a glaze. So a glaze is a real watery, thinned down version of the paint, almost maybe 1:20 ratio, which just changes the hue of the paint underneath that you're applying the glaze to. This is a bit more thick. This is probably maybe 2 parts paint, 5 parts water, just to get some thicker colour down. It's not really going for a glaze, but I want to bring the highlights up in stages. Now you can go as far as you like with this. You can really glaze it and really bring a really good blend to the part. So I'm going to be focusing here on the shoulder pad, making sure now I don't go into the areas of shade with the non-oil wash. And because it's quite thin, it will take many coats. I mean, this is where you can go to town really. You can go as many coats as you like. I'm aiming for maybe 2 or 3 here, I believe, and each successive coat will be slightly higher up on the shoulder pad. So the first one here, almost to the edge of where the black is, and then the next one, subsequent ones after that, will be slightly higher up, and that will, you'll see a gradual blend, and it's quite a smooth blend with the thin down paint like this. Now some of the details are pretty tricky, trying to get into the chest cavity. Not overly fussed to go to town in that area because it will be covered with a gun eventually. But the legs and shoulder pads are quite prominent on the model, as is the face, and that's the bit that catches people's eyes. So this is the bit where you really want to work on. And because it is quite thin and watery, it does, and it's not pooling, it does dry quite quick. So you can come back to each shoulder pad, move down to the legs. By the time you've done that, within 20-30 seconds, it's already dry. And there you can see, just comparing one that hasn't had a highlight to one with the highlight we've just applied, you can see it's just sort of beginning to pop a little bit more now. So there we go. Once we've done all the gold and the blue, you should end up with something looking vaguely like this photograph here. Now there is still more highlights to come, but that will be on the next video. So thanks for watching. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Be much appreciated. Subscriptions don't cost you any money. And they do get notifications every time I open up a video and stick it on YouTube. So thanks for watching, catch you next time.